It's a book that is on high on my list of books I tell people that they should read, which is Thomas Sowell, a wonderful author who wrote a book called Inside the Education System. And he explains that one of the biggest myths about the pro-life movement is the idea that they started teaching sex ed in school because people were just having sex. Actually, America was a remarkably conservative, sexually conservative country all across the board in the 1950s. The majority of high school kids were finishing high school with their graduation, with their virginity intact, And then the government decided to get into the classroom and teach sex ed, okay? And just in one decade, within 10 years, this completely changed. And now kids were having sex, and this is what we are dealing with today, right? So first and foremost, it was the government deciding that they were going to step in and be your family that led to this problem of women that were having premarital sex. The culture changed. The government was behind that culture shift. Planned Parenthood got into the classroom and began pushing down their books because they see an entire market of people that they can feed into the pharmaceutical industry with birth control, another ill in our society that's making women sick, but we'll park that aside for another conversation. Hormones and putting hormones in your body all the time is obviously making people ill, and they can't see that. People have forgotten the history. The government created the problem, right? We actually, the solution was families intact and families that were talking to mom and dad about the bees and the birds. And then a government created a lie. This is a fact. This is not, no, this is a fact. It's not like a no thing. You can read the book Inside the Education System. It has all of the sources. It is a fact statistically. And then the government transformed culture by telling kids they didn't need their parents and they could make decisions by themselves. Now you're saying we have kids that are having sex. We have people that are getting pregnant irresponsibly. We created that problem. So now obviously the government can fix it. This is the same thing with welfare, right? It's a fact that Black Americans.
Before you get to welfare, I just want to push back on the sex ed thing. I'm happy to talk welfare.
No, but it's the same. I want to put these two points together. It's the same thing with welfare. It's the same thing with welfare. You have people saying we need more welfare, more government solutions. The government created the problem. The government intentionally, we had a racist president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who intentionally broke down Black families when Black Americans were outpacing white Americans in terms of economic growth. This is why people have fond memories of their grandparents being together. We have good music, all of these good values. The family units were together. And then what happened? The hippies generation came in, the government broke down Black families, and Black Americans became more impoverished than we've ever been in our entire life, despite $3 trillion being spent on welfare policies since the early 1970s. Black Americans are poorer today. The government does not create solutions. They only start problems and then tell you that the solution to the problems is more governments, which just actually creates more problems. It's a vicious cycle. Put the government out, put the families back together.
So a couple of things, just a couple of fact checks. The idea, first of all, and I've studied the history of sex ed quite extensively, and sometimes I teach about it. And I'm a professor of urban education, and one of the things we talk about is sort of the rise of it. It actually begins not in the 1950s, but it begins in the 1920s, and it begins actually for very good reason. It wasn't about pregnancy. You're right. Pregnancy wasn't the biggest problem. You know what the biggest problem was? Gonorrhea. Gonorrhea and syphilis to soldiers after World War I. Everybody was getting all the stuff, right? Because soldiers weren't wearing condoms. They didn't know about that stuff. And the government said, the military said, we can't have unhealthy soldiers. So what we're going to do, they've passed the, I believe it's called the Chamberlain-Conn Act. It's in 1918. Yeah, the Chamberlain-Conn Act, I'm 90% sure it's called. Y'all can fact check me if I'm wrong. But they passed the Chamberlain-Conn Act in 1918, which mandated sex education to soldiers. And then by the 1920s, 1930s, that expanded to schools. So by the 1930s and 1940s, somewhere between 20 and 40% of public school or of all schools in the country were doing sex education. But you're right. The part you're right about, and this is, again, the Thomas Sowell kind of sleight of hand that happens from right wingers sometimes, in my perspective, is that, yeah, it's true that there wasn't a lot of anti-pregnancy talk before the 50s. And yeah, there wasn't a lot of, less than half of the people weren't doing sex education in schools, but somewhere up around 40% were, and it was to stop these diseases. And then what happens in the 50s is, I think, a really important thing, and that's the question of abstinence only. If we're going to teach about sex ed in school, do we want it to be abstinence only, or do we want to talk about people's sexual rights and people's sexual freedoms? Do we want to just say the answer to not get pregnant is don't have sex, which is sure, like that's true, just like, safe gun handling, don't buy a gun, right? But if we're going to say, like, if you're going to use these things and do these things, how do we respond to it? That becomes a different conversation. So this wasn't just the government intervening in people's moral.
It was. Your fact is wrong here. The majority of kids I said were graduating with their virginity. They were not having
I'm
sex.
not disputing that.
Yeah, but I know. But you're saying is that, but they were just having sex, and there was just problem with gonorrhea. That's just not right. And he also has statistics about the STIs. And to your point, I don't think anybody thinks of Thomas Sowell as a right winger. He's pretty apolitical. I mean, he's conservative in terms of his economics. He's obviously trained under Milton Friedman, but that wouldn't make him produce a book that shows you statistics. I mean, he cares deeply about looking at the numbers and making sure that they make sense. He's one of the greatest.
If you think Thomas Sowell doesn't make right-wing arguments, I mean, whether it's about affirmative action, whether it's about sex education, whether it's about, like you just said,
what he continually shows you is that every time the government intervenes, after you are able to do this look back, things are worse. So how can your solution be? If you can tell me a time, and we can talk about Black Americans, women, where government intervened and it actually solved the problem.
Sure,
because affirmative action didn't. Affirmative action absolutely didn't. Misplacing Black kids has harmed them.
I'll give you a few, but just to be clear, an example I just gave you: soldiers were getting gonorrhea, and their STI reduction.
Or soldiers overseas are sleeping with. I totally can, but we are talking about.
But you asked the question. I'm answering your question, which was you asked what government solution to a problem. Well, in this case, the government intervened and soldiers got fewer STIs. That is a solution to a problem. But if we want to talk about public policy for citizens, I'm happy to give you a more substantive one. I think that's a good one.
What do you mean the government hasn't stopped people from getting STDs? What are you talking about?
No,
they intervened and they created more problems. Not that they intervened.
No, I disagree. I disagree. The evidence of something working isn't that the problem goes to zero. If for example, there is a high STI rate or a high suicide rate or a high whatever rate, and it drops dramatically through an intervention, the intervention is effective. And what I'm saying
I would argue that there are higher STI rates, I would imagine now today than there were in the 1920s. Simply on the basis that the majority of people had their virginity intact, whether that's in the military or abroad.
But let's go to another. Just in the interest of time, let's go to another